On the evening of November 13th, 1892, 13 residents of Briarwood, Illinois, received elegant handwritten invitations to what would become known as the feast no one returned from. The ivory parchment, sealed with black wax bearing an intricate tree symbol, summoned each neighbor to dine at the estate of the mysterious Briarwood Society. By dawn, 13 names had been erased from the living world overnight, leaving behind only empty homes, cold hearths, and a mystery that would haunt the prairie town for generations. What authorities discovered in the abandoned manor would challenge every rational explanation, transforming a simple dinner invitation into one of America's most chilling unsolved disappearances. The banquet that devoured a neighborhood began with courtesy and ended in terror. For those who seek the forgotten truths buried beneath layers of time and silence, who understand that history's darkest chapters often remain unwritten, this is your invitation to witness what happens when hospitality becomes horror. Subscribe to join our community of truth seekers and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from as we uncover the mystery that authorities tried desperately to bury. The gravity of what occurred in Briarwood that November night demands your attention, for some stories refuse to remain silent. In 1892, Illinois stood at the crossroads of America's Industrial Revolution and rural tradition. The prairie state had recovered from the financial panic of 1873, but small towns like Briarwood remained islands of agricultural stability in an ocean of rapid change. Located 60 miles southwest of Springfield, Briarwood was home to fewer than 800 souls, most of whom traced their roots to German and Irish immigrants who had settled the fertile bottomland along Timber Creek in the 1850s. The town's isolation was both blessing and curse, protecting residents from urban corruption while fostering an insularity that bred suspicion of outsiders and reverence for established order. The Briarwood Society had existed since the town's founding, though few residents could articulate its exact purpose. County records from 1856 reference the organization as a fraternal order dedicated to the preservation of community values and natural harmony. But their meetings were held in secret and membership remained invitation only. The society maintained the old Whitmore estate, a sprawling Gothic revival mansion built by the town's founder Cornelius Whitmore, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1861. The estate sat on 40 acres of oak and maple forest at Briarwood's northern edge, its tower visible from the town square, but its grounds forbidden to casual visitors. The 13 neighbors who received invitations represented a cross-section of Briarwood's most respected families. There was Heinrich Müller, the German blacksmith whose horseshoes were prized throughout the county, and his wife Martha, known for her apple strudel and charitable works. The Donnelly family, Patrick, a railroad engineer, his wife Bridget, and their adult daughter Catherine, occupied the large frame house on Elm Street. Dr. Jeremiah Ashford, the town's only physician, received an invitation, as did the widow Eleanor Preston, whose late husband had owned the grain mill. Samuel and Rebecca Holt, proprietors of the general store, were summoned alongside their business rival, merchant Thomas Crane. The final invitees included the schoolmaster William Porter, the Methodist preacher's wife Agnes Carmichael, and 2 elderly sisters, the Mrs. Clara and Ida Thornton, who lived together in their deceased father's Victorian cottage. On the morning of November 13th, residents of Briarwood began discovering the ivory-colored invitations slipped beneath their doors sometime during the night. Each bore identical calligraphy in midnight black ink, formally requesting the honor of their presence at a harvest celebration dinner to be held at the Whitmore estate that very evening at 8 o'clock. The invitations were signed simply the Briarwood Society in an ornate script, with the tree symbol pressed deep into the black wax seal. No resident could recall seeing the messenger, and several noted that their dogs, typically vigilant against strangers, had remained silent throughout the night. As word spread through the small community, a mixture of honor and curiosity swept through the invited families. The Briarwood Society had never before extended such open hospitality, and many saw the invitation as recognition of their standing in the community. Heinrich Müller told his assistant that he felt chosen for something important, while Dr. Ashford confided to his journal that he hoped the evening might provide insight into the Society's mysterious activities. Eleanor Preston spent the afternoon selecting her finest black silk dress, the one she had worn to her husband's funeral, believing the occasion demanded her most formal attire. As twilight approached, the 13 neighbors made their way through the November chill toward the Whitmore estate. Several residents witnessed their departure, noting how each guest appeared unusually formal, dressed in their Sunday finest despite the weekday evening. Catherine Donnelly wore her grandmother's pearl necklace, while the elderly Thornton sisters were observed carrying small wrapped gifts, apparently for their host. The last confirmed sighting came from young Timothy Walsh, who was returning from evening chores, and saw the final guest, Dr. Ashford, walking up the lamplit path to the estate's imposing front door at precisely 8 o'clock. The Whitmore mansion stood like a dark cathedral against the autumn sky, its Gothic windows glowing with warm amber light. Neighbors later reported that unusual sounds carried across the fields that evening, strains of unfamiliar music, neither hymnal nor folk melody, drifting from the estate's direction. The melody was described as haunting and ceremonial, played on instruments that none could identify. Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, whose farm bordered the estate's eastern edge, told investigators that the music seemed to pulse with an almost hypnotic rhythm, causing her cattle to grow restless and her chickens to fall unnaturally silent. At approximately 10:30 that evening, the music swelled to what several witnesses described as a crescendo of almost unbearable intensity. The melody reached its peak, then stopped with such abruptness that the sudden silence seemed to echo across the prairie. Mrs. Jenkins noted that her pocket watch read exactly 10:30 when the music ceased, and that the estate's windows immediately went dark, as though every lamp had been extinguished simultaneously. No further sounds emerged from the direction of the mansion, and no guests were observed leaving the property. When dawn broke over Briarwood on November 14th, the first signs of something amiss became apparent. Heinrich Mueller had failed to open his blacksmith shop, and smoke was not rising from the Donnelly chimney. Dr. Ashford had not responded to an urgent summons to attend a difficult birth, and the general store remained shuttered despite the morning hour. By midday, concerned family members and neighbors began gathering in the town square, sharing their growing alarm that none of the previous evening's dinner guests had been seen since their departure for the estate. Sheriff Amos Rourke, a practical man with 20 years of law enforcement experience, initially dismissed the concerns as overreaction. He suggested that the dinner party had simply extended later than expected, and that the guests might be sleeping late after an evening of celebration. However, as the afternoon progressed and no word came from any of the 13 neighbors, Rourke's skepticism gave way to genuine concern. At 4 o'clock, accompanied by his deputy and 2 concerned citizens, the sheriff made his way to the Whitmore estate to investigate. What they discovered defied rational explanation. The mansion's front door stood ajar, creaking softly in the November wind. Inside, the formal dining room had been set for exactly 13 guests, with fine bone china, crystal goblets, and silver flatware arranged on an antique mahogany table. The places showed no signs of having been used. The plates remained pristine, the glasses empty, the napkins folded in precise triangles beside each setting. 13 chairs were pushed back from the table at identical angles, as though the guests had risen in perfect unison. In the center of the table sat a magnificent feast that appeared untouched: roasted pheasant with wild berry sauce, venison medallions, fresh bread still warm to the touch, and seasonal vegetables arranged with artistic precision. Candles burned in tall silver holders, their flames steady in the still air, though no servants were present to tend them. The entire scene suggested that dinner had been served and immediately abandoned, yet there was no indication of what had caused the guests to depart so abruptly. Sheriff Rourke's investigation revealed additional disturbing details throughout the mansion. In the library, he discovered a leather-bound ledger lying open on the desk, its pages filled with names, dates, and cryptic notations in the same elegant script as the dinner invitations. The final entry, dated November 13th, 1892, listed the names of all 13 missing guests, alongside a notation that read simply, "The harvest is complete." Attempts to decipher the earlier entries proved futile, as the text appeared to be written in a mixture of Latin and symbols that no local scholar could translate. The mansion's upper floors yielded more questions than answers. Guest bedrooms had been prepared for overnight visitors, with fresh linens and wash basins filled with clean water, but showed no signs of occupancy. A hidden door behind the library's main bookshelf revealed a narrow staircase descending into the earth beneath the mansion. The sheriff and his men followed the stone steps down into what appeared to be a natural cavern that had been modified for unknown purposes. The underground chamber stretched far beyond the reach of their lantern light, its walls carved with intricate symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing flames. Along the chamber's perimeter stood 13 stone pedestals, each topped with a silver chalice that gleamed with an oily, dark residue. The air in the cavern carried a strange metallic scent, mixed with something organic and unsettling, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Most disturbing of all, the cavern appeared to have no other exits, no tunnels or passages that might explain how 13 people could simply vanish into the earth. Back in the dining room, Deputy Marshal investigated more closely and made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Beneath each chair, carved into the wooden floor itself, were symbols matching those found in the underground chamber. The carvings appeared fresh, as though completed recently, yet the wood around them had aged to match the rest of the floor perfectly. When he lifted one of the chairs to examine the marking more closely, he noticed that the symbol seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence that disappeared the moment he looked directly at it. As news of the discovery spread through Briarwood, panic began to take hold of the small community. The missing 13 had been pillars of local society, and their simultaneous disappearance left gaping holes in the town's social fabric. Heinrich Müller's forge stood cold and silent, while the general store remained locked, disrupting commerce throughout the area. Dr. Ashford's absence meant the community had no medical care, and Preacher Carmichael was forced to conduct services alone after his wife's disappearance. Sheriff Rourke expanded his investigation, interviewing every resident who might have witnessed suspicious activity around the estate. What he uncovered painted a picture of long-standing strangeness surrounding the Briarwood Society and the Whitmore mansion. Several elderly residents recalled that similar disappearances had occurred in the past, though the stories had been dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. Old Timothy Brennan, the town's oldest resident at 87, claimed that his grandfather had spoken of neighbors who had vanished after attending society gatherings in the 1860s and 70s. The sheriff's inquiries into the society's membership proved equally fruitless. No one could name a current member of the organization, and records of their activities seemed to exist only in fragments and rumors. The deed to the Whitmore estate was held by a trust, whose trustees were listed simply as the Briarwood Society Board, with no individual names provided. Attempts to trace the trust through legal channels led only to a series of dead ends and law offices that claimed no knowledge of the organization. On November 20th, exactly 1 week after the disappearances, the investigation took a shocking turn. A local farmer named James Morrison, while searching for his lost cattle near the estate's southern boundary, discovered what appeared to be a fresh grave hidden among the oak trees. Sheriff Rourke and his men carefully excavated the site, expecting to finally find evidence of what had befallen the missing guests. What they unearthed defied all expectations. The grave contained not 13 bodies, but a single corpse in an advanced state of decomposition that appeared to have been buried for months or even years. The body was that of a man dressed in formal evening wear, similar to what the missing guests had worn. Most disturbingly, the man's eye sockets were empty, not from decay, but as though the eyes had been deliberately removed. In his coat pocket, investigators found a business card identifying him as Cornelius Whitmore, founder and eternal president, the Briarwood Society. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. According to town records, Cornelius Whitmore had disappeared in 1861, over 30 years earlier, yet the body showed signs of much more recent burial. The formal wear was of contemporary style, and a pocket watch found with the corpse had stopped at exactly 10:30, the same time witnesses reported the music ceasing on the night of November 13th. The implications were both impossible and undeniable. Somehow the town's long-dead founder had been present at the dinner that claimed 13 lives. Dr. Martin Webb, a forensic expert from Springfield, was brought in to examine the corpse and provide scientific analysis of the scene. His findings only deepened the mystery. The body showed signs of ritualistic preparation. The limbs had been carefully arranged, the clothing precisely adjusted, and the empty eye sockets filled with what appeared to be melted silver that had hardened into small, perfectly round orbs. Most puzzling of all, despite the advanced decomposition, the body emanated a faint but persistent odor of fresh roses, as though flowers had been recently placed in the grave. The investigation reached its horrifying climax when Sheriff Rourke made one final search of the mansion's upper floors. In what had once served as Cornelius Whitmore's private study, he discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall. Inside was a collection of journals dating back to the town's founding, written in the same elegant script as the dinner invitations. The journals detailed the true purpose of the Briarwood Society and the ritualistic feasts that had been conducted for over 40 years. According to Whitmore's writings, the society existed to maintain what he called the covenant of the soil, a supernatural agreement that ensured Briarwood's prosperity through periodic offerings to ancient forces that predated human settlement. The feasts served as harvest ceremonies, where carefully selected community members were transformed into guardians of the town's continued fortune. The missing guests had not been murdered, according to Whitmore's deranged philosophy, but elevated to a higher purpose, their essence binding them permanently to the land they had loved in life. The final journal entry, dated November 13, 1892, and written in a different hand, described the completion of what Whitmore called the greatest harvest in the society's history. 13 souls had been gathered for the ultimate ceremony, their life forces channeled into the earth itself to ensure Briarwood's survival for another generation. The entry concluded with a chilling promise: the feast is eternal, the harvest never ends, and the society's work continues beyond the grave. As Sheriff Rourke finished reading the journals, he became aware of sounds emanating from the mansion's lower levels. The same haunting music that witnesses had heard on the night of November 13th began to drift up from the underground chamber, played by invisible musicians on instruments that produced no earthly melody. The sheriff and his men fled the estate, but not before seeing 13 figures in formal evening wear standing in the mansion's windows, their faces pale and their eyes reflecting the dying afternoon light with an unnatural luminescence. The immediate aftermath of these revelations tore the community of Briarwood apart. Half the residents refused to believe the supernatural explanations, insisting that the missing neighbors had simply left town together for reasons of their own. The other half lived in terror, convinced that the Briarwood Society's influence extended far beyond the estate's boundaries. Property values plummeted as families began abandoning their homes, seeking safety in distant cities where ancient covenants held no power. Sheriff Rourke submitted his final report on December 1st, 1892, concluding that 13 residents had disappeared under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. He recommended that the Whitmore estate be declared a public hazard and sealed indefinitely, a recommendation that the county commissioners hastily approved. The mansion was boarded up, its grounds declared off-limits to all civilian access, and the case was officially closed as unsolved due to lack of physical evidence. The sealing of the estate did not end the strange occurrences in Briarwood. Residents continued to report unexplained phenomena: the sound of dinner bells ringing across the prairie on moonless nights, the scent of roasted meat drifting from the direction of the abandoned mansion, and shadowy figures walking the streets after midnight, wearing the formal attire of another era. Several families reported receiving mysterious invitations slipped under their doors, written in the same elegant script as the original dinner summons, though these were quickly burned without being read. In the months following the disappearances, Briarwood began to experience an unusual prosperity that only added to residents' unease. Crops grew with unprecedented abundance, livestock remained healthy despite harsh winter conditions, and the town's businesses flourished in ways that seemed to defy economic logic. The railroad announced plans to extend a spur line to Briarwood, bringing promises of increased commerce and connection to larger markets. For those who remained in the community, the benefits were undeniable, but the cost was a persistent sense that their good fortune came at a terrible price. The official records of the Briarwood disappearances were sealed in the Illinois State Archives, marked as sensitive material due to the potential for public panic. Sheriff Rourke resigned his position in the spring of 1893 and left Illinois entirely, settling in Oregon where he spent his remaining years raising sheep and refusing to discuss his law enforcement career. Dr. Webb published a brief paper on unusual decomposition patterns he had observed during his forensic work in Illinois, but made no mention of the supernatural circumstances surrounding his research. The Whitmore estate remained sealed for nearly 2 decades, its Gothic silhouette serving as a constant reminder of the night 13 neighbors vanished. In 1911, the county decided to demolish the mansion and sell the land for agricultural development, hoping to finally put the tragic chapter behind them. However, when work crews arrived to begin demolition, they discovered that the building's interior had been completely transformed. The formal dining room, which had been left untouched since the night of the disappearances, now showed signs of recent use. 13 place settings remained on the mahogany table, but the dishes contained fresh food that appeared to have been recently served. The candles burned with steady flames, despite having been left unattended for nearly 20 years. Most disturbing of all, the chairs around the table were occupied by 13 figures in formal evening wear, their faces serene but their eyes completely white, as though filled with the same silver that had been found in Cornelius Whitmore's empty sockets. The demolition was immediately called off, and the estate was resealed with additional security measures. The 13 figures remained in their chairs, visible through the mansion's windows to anyone brave enough to approach the building. Over the subsequent years, various paranormal investigators and curiosity seekers attempted to enter the estate, but all reported the same phenomenon: the sound of elegant conversation and clinking silverware emanating from the dining room, accompanied by that same haunting music that had marked the original feast. By the 1920s, most of the families who had witnessed the original disappearances had either died or moved away from Briarwood. The town's population dwindled as younger generations sought opportunities in larger cities, and the unusual prosperity that had followed the feast began to fade. The railroad spur line was never completed, businesses closed, and the fertile fields that had once produced abundant crops gradually returned to wild prairie grass. In 1934, during the depths of the Great Depression, a descendant of one of the missing families attempted to research the case and seek closure for her family's loss. Margaret Donnelly, granddaughter of the railroad engineer Patrick Donnelly, traveled from Chicago to examine whatever records remained of her grandfather's disappearance. What she discovered in the county courthouse basement was a single file box containing the original investigation materials, including Sheriff Rourke's reports and Dr. Webb's forensic notes. Among these documents, Margaret found something that chilled her blood: a guest registry book from the Whitmore estate, apparently overlooked during the original investigation. The leather-bound volume contained the signatures of everyone who had attended society functions over the decades, dating back to the organization's founding. The final page, dated November 13, 1892, bore the signatures of all 13 missing guests, written in their own hands. But below their names, in the same elegant script as the dinner invitations, someone had written 13 additional entries, all dated various dates in the future, some extending into the 20th century and beyond. The implications were terrifying. The feast had not been a single event, but the beginning of an ongoing cycle. The missing guests had not simply died, but had been transformed into something else, something that would continue the society's work across the decades. Margaret fled Briarwood that same day, taking the guest registry with her, but not before making one final devastating discovery. The last entry in the book, dated December 23, 1934, bore her own name. Margaret Donnelly disappeared from her Chicago home on December 22, 1934. Her landlord found her apartment empty, except for a formal invitation, written in elegant script on ivory parchment and sealed with black wax bearing the tree symbol of the Briarwood Society. The invitation was addressed to her grandfather, Patrick Donnelly, welcoming him to a reunion dinner at the Whitmore estate. A note in Margaret's handwriting, pinned to her bedroom door, read simply, "The feast never ends. Some invitations cannot be refused." The Briarwood case officially remained closed, but reports of strange occurrences at the abandoned estate continued throughout the 20th century. During World War II, military training exercises near the site were repeatedly disrupted by the sound of dinner music and the sight of formally dressed figures walking the estate grounds. In the 1960s, hippies attempting to use the mansion for a commune fled after a single night, claiming that 13 ghostly dinner guests had invited them to stay permanently. The most recent documented incident occurred in 1987, when a real estate developer attempted to purchase the estate for a housing subdivision. The developer, Robert Hayes, spent several days surveying the property and reportedly found the mansion in perfect condition despite decades of abandonment. The formal dining room remained exactly as witnesses had described it in 1892, complete with place settings for 13 guests and food that appeared freshly prepared. Hayes fled the property after discovering his own name written in the guest registry book, dated for the following evening. Today, the Whitmore estate stands empty but not abandoned, its Gothic windows still glowing with amber light on certain November nights. The town of Briarwood has largely vanished, its buildings reclaimed by prairie grass and its streets marked only by crumbling foundations. But the mansion endures, maintained by forces that require no human caretakers, waiting for the next harvest season to begin. The guest registry that Margaret Donnelly discovered has surfaced occasionally at estate auctions and antique sales throughout the Midwest, though it never remains in any single owner's possession for long. Those who have examined it report that new names continue to appear in its pages, written in that same elegant script, always dated for future dinner parties that seem destined to occur whether the invited guests choose to attend or not. Local historians who have studied the case believe that the Briarwood Society represented a corruption of indigenous spiritual practices, twisted by European settlers into something far darker than the original ceremonies ever intended. The covenant of the soil that Cornelius Whitmore wrote about may have been based on genuine Native American traditions of reciprocity with the land, perverted into a cycle of supernatural predation that fed on the community it claimed to protect. The 13 neighbors who vanished after attending the banquet on November 13, 1892, remain officially listed as missing persons in Illinois state records. Their descendants occasionally attempt to research the case or visit the site of their ancestors' disappearance, but few complete their investigations. Those who do often report receiving their own invitations, written in familiar script on ivory parchment, summoning them to join a feast that began over a century ago but has never truly ended. The Briarwood Society's work continues, as Cornelius Whitmore promised it would. Beyond the boundaries of death and time, the harvest is eternal, the feast never concludes, and somewhere in the ruins of a forgotten Illinois town, 13 dinner guests maintain their eternal vigil, waiting to welcome new members to their supernatural communion. The banquet that devoured a neighborhood in 1892 remains set and ready, its candles burning bright, its invitation always extended to those who seek to understand the true cost of prosperity built on ancient covenants. For in Briarwood, Illinois, some doors should remain unopened, some feasts should never be attended, and some invitations should be burned rather than accepted. The 13 neighbors learned this truth too late, and their lesson echoes across the decades as a warning to all who would sup at tables where the price of admission is measured not in currency, but in souls. The Society's feast awaits, patient and eternal, ready to transform curiosity into tragedy, and guests into guardians of secrets too dark for the living world to comprehend.